Okay, we're ready. Thank you so much for coming. I mean, obviously you're all here, but thank you. I'm really grateful to be here. I'm so grateful for this opportunity, and it has been an intellectually invigorating experience these last couple of days. I've gained so many ideas, so thank you very much for this, the possibility of coming. So, my talk today, The Guide to Modern Cooking, Viewing Sudanese Women's Labor Through a Home Economics Textbook. And without further ado, I will jump in. So, how and where can we trace the history of working women and of women working when sources seem limited or lacking? I address this question for Sudanese history by considering one Arabic book which offers insights into female labor in households, called Dalil, al-tahi, al-hadith, or The Guide to Modern Cooking. This volume was a textbook and cookbook which the Sudanese government published in 1973. It covered diet, nutrition, and exercise, gave advice for arranging the home, and included recipes organized thematically, such as meat dishes, vegetables, hot and cold sweets, and so on. Its authors, Madina Babikr al-Ghali and Nafisa Khalil Jabbara, were employees of the Sudanese Ministry of Education and presidents of the home economics sections of the Secondary Teachers Training School and the Teachers Training College, respectively. 50 years ago, this book, a cheap black and white edition with occasional cartoon-style illustrations, circulated among females in Sudanese secondary schools. But today, the Guide to Modern Cooking is rare. WorldCat, the union catalog for tens of thousands of libraries around the world, registers only one copy anywhere, at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Recognizing its singularity, the Library of Congress refuses to share it through the American system of interlibrary loan, meaning that scholars can only read it on site. And that's because they want to preserve it, because they realize it's the only copy. And they realize that because I found it and then tried to borrow it. And then they looked into the system and realized that it was, they didn't realize it was the only copy. It's only when I tried to borrow it that they realized. The rarity of the Guide to Modern Cooking serves as a metaphor for the often invisible and hard-to-reach history of women. Historians agree that cookbooks in the modern era, whether in English, Arabic, or other languages, have often been associated with female domestic work and undervalued as scholarly texts. These assumptions explain why few academic institutions have consistently collected and catalogued cookbooks, and why an Arabic book like this one may have become ephemeral. The Guide to Modern Cooking, nevertheless, has many lessons to share. It reveals attitudes about female domesticity and beauty, and about health and hygiene. It yields information about technology and material culture, suggesting how households might have been changing to include kitchens with appliances like refrigerators. It reflects nationalism and class dynamics. When the government published this text in 1973, during the lull between the First and Second Sudanese civil wars, female secondary education was expanding. Against this context, the book addressed students as members of Sudan's aspirational middle classes, while presenting Sudanese women as cultured, modern, and yet respectful towards traditions. When I first found The Guide to Modern Cooking, I read it as a cookbook. At the time, I was a visiting fellow in the Middle Eastern and African Division of the Library of Congress, which had invited me to use its collections and to give a public lecture that related to the theme of national religious literacy. The Library of Congress had received a grant from a private philanthropic foundation for this purpose, from the Lilly Endowment, which is associated with the Lilly Pharmaceutical Company. I chose to investigate the library's English and Arabic cookbooks from the Middle East and North Africa, as well as from Middle Eastern American diasporas in the United States, to consider culinary dimensions of religious culture among Muslims, Christians, and Jews. I was interested in seeing how cookbooks promoted commensality, a concept which refers to sitting and eating at the same table, but which suggests how people can build mutual respect and a sense of community by sharing food. I began to read the Guide to Modern Cooking during this research visit, and it was the only Sudanese cookbook I found. But the more I thought about it, the more it intrigued me, not as a cookbook, but as a textbook, projecting models of Sudanese women as modern homemakers, wives, and mothers. I found myself asking, what was the book trying to do? What did it want or expect of its readers? And what kind of people did its readers go on to become? It will be impossible for historians to answer this last question about the subsequent lives of its readers unless we can interview graduates of Sudanese home economics programs. I actually have a colleague who did something similar for Lebanese women. So I can think of models where people have done this, but we would need to do this for Sudan. We can nevertheless draw some conclusions by assessing the book from its content. For example, its authors seem to assume that Sudanese women would engage in significant day-to-day labor procuring, preparing, and serving food, cleaning the house, washing clothes, entertaining guests, supervising children, and more. They treated readers not only as homemakers, but as business managers, indeed like home economists, but without suggesting that they would get money for the work that they did. Women's work would thus constitute what social scientists call invisible labor within the informal economy. This book raises two questions that intrigue me, among others, but two stand out here. First, would the women modeled in the book have qualified as female urban professionals, to use one of this conference's organizing themes? I suspect that if we could have asked the authors, they would have said yes. Yes, that these homemakers were professionals. Their conviction would have reflected the fact that home economics was not just an academic subject in the 20th century, but, as the historian Megan Elias has suggested, an organized social movement, which can loosely be described as a movement to professionalize domestic work and domestic space. Second, were the women presented or imagined on its pages working women, to go back to a question I raised at the beginning, or just women working, and is there a difference? The English phrase working women implies paid employment. When you use that phrase in English, it implies employment outside the home, so that the phrase working women would seem not to apply. And yet, since women's housework has been critical for making societies run, I would argue that we should recognize it and study it within the context of labor history, whether women got paid for their work or not. My research is very preliminary, and yet what I've learned so far from studying this Sudanese book relative to a larger secondary literature about home economics and housework has convinced me that the social realities and imaginaries that it presented were common to other countries in this period. So for this reason, as you will see as I continue speaking, I consider the Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking relative to the United States, Egypt, and the United Kingdom, three countries which were conduits for ideas about home economics that made their way to the Sudan. But before surveying this international background, I want to make a few points about this text as an Arabic instructional manual with recipes, what we would commonly call in English a cookbook, even though not all of the recipes involve food or cooking, because the book also includes instructions for household cleaning products. The association of Arabic cookbooks with women is a recent historical phenomenon. In the early Islamic era, from roughly the 10th century through the 15th, Arabic cookbooks flourished as a literary genre among men, and elite men who often had ties to the courts of caliphs and sultans. The gender dynamics of Arabic cookbooks flipped in the 20th century, starting in Egypt, where rising literacy rates sustained a popular culture of printing and reading. Increasingly, Arabic cookbooks became a literary form produced mostly by and for women. The Guide to Modern Cooking testifies to the expansion of female literacy and education in the Sudan and to shifting gender dynamics in the history of reading and books. And these two images here are, there's an increasing movement right now to translate early Islamic Arabic cookbooks and to do annotated editions. These are just a couple of books that have come out in the last a couple of years. One is a 13th century text. This one is 14th and 15th century. And so we're seeing more of these starting to become available in scholarly editions. Now, to understand what made the Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking possible, we must look northward to Egypt, which became an early testing ground in the Arabic-speaking world for home economics. Sometimes called domestic science, home economics first developed in the United States during the early 19th century and went on to become not just a subject of academic study with theoretical and practical dimensions, but again, an international movement led by women. It entered Egypt through Christian missionary schools that Americans started beginning in the 1850s, and after about 1900 spread to the Sudan. A brief discussion of this field and how it developed in the United States before reaching the Nile Valley can set the stage for our Sudanese case study. An important early figure in establishing the field was the American Catherine Beecher, who published a book in 1841 called A Treatise on Domestic Economy for the use of young ladies at home and at school. Later, in 1869, Beecher published another book called The American Woman's Home with her more famous sister, the abolitionist and novelist Harriet Beecher Stowe. An educational reformer, Catherine Beecher first tested her ideas in a women's institute that she founded in Connecticut in the 1820s. She argued that there should be special colleges for training teachers, that pedagogy was itself a skill, and it was a subject that you could study and treat as a science. She also believed that exercise and sports should be central to girls' education. And she had firm ideas about food and promoted vegetarian and whole grain diets. And yet Beecher strenuously rejected the idea that women should be able to vote. Her mix of progressive and conservative, even retrograde or retrogressive ideas makes her a fascinating figure and seems appropriate for the ambiguous history of home economics as an academic subject, which has often seemed to liberate and confine women at the same time, to subvert patriarchal orders and to maintain them. What made Catherine Beecher's book so path-breaking, according to one historian, is that she was the first popular writer to suggest that the home should be run on business principles. She was also the first, and here I'm quoting, to attempt to claim professional status for homemaking. But whether she was a feminist is another question, and one that remains a source of debate. Ideas about treating homemaking as a profession and science took clearer form after 1909, when a group gathered for a conference in Lake Placid, New York, and agreed to call their subject home economics, using a term that emphasized the financial management of households. A giant in this emerging movement was a chemist named Ellen Swallow Richards, who was the first woman to receive a degree from MIT. Some also describe her as the first scientist to apply chemistry to the systematic study of nutrition. Richards had a keen interest in bacteriology and food and water safety. And in fact, she was, some say, the first to establish the first modern water sewage treatment plant. And she also established test kitchens in Boston, which functioned like laboratories. We can see the long-term influence of Ellen Swallow Richards and her successors on textbooks like the Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking, which approach the subject as a science while regarding kitchens as de facto laboratories. Whatever the field was called, domestic science or home economics, it quickly spread in the Nile Valley. Again, American missionaries introduced the subject in their girls' schools in Egypt, and Egyptian families and authorities embraced it. As early as 1873, the Egyptian government under Khedive Ismail opened a girls' school that included the domestic arts in its curriculum. By the 1890s, Egyptian nationalist writers began to discuss the desirability of tadbir al-manzil, home management, for creating modern households and families, and by extension, a modern country. One leader in this movement was a Lebanese writer based in Egypt named Malika Saad, who published a popular Arabic journal for women called Al-Jins al-Latif, the Fair Sex, in the opening years of the 20th century. In 1915, Malika Saad also published a popular manual called Rabat ad-Dar, Mistress of the House, which argued for the importance of domestic science in modern homes. I don't have a picture of her. I don't know that there are any photographs of her, so I put up the Khedive, but I wish I had a picture of her. These ideas quickly caught on in the Sudan. After the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of 1898, British missionaries started girls' schools in Greater Khartoum, which introduced gender-specific ideas about education. Besides teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic, girls' schools emphasized needlework and making decorative items such as cushion covers or embroidered handkerchiefs. When the educational reformer Babikr Badri started the first Sudanese school for girls in Rufa in 1907, he copied the missionary model by including needlework in the curriculum too. He considered this gender-specific education to be very modern. But note that this gender specificity broke from earlier practice, because while it had been extremely rare for Sudanese girls to become literate before the 20th century, when they did study, they had studied the same subjects as boys, which is the Quran and mathematics. I suspect, too, that these early girls' schools emphasized needlework and not cooking, and not even sewing, not sewing dresses at this stage. This is needlework like embroidery, because it would have been easier to access materials needed for embroidery, cloth, thread, needles, than for cooking, space, equipment, utensils, ingredients, and water for cleaning. In the 1920s and 30s, as missionary and independent girls' schools expanded in the Sudan, a new kind of independent school started called the Needlework Home, or Beit el-Khiyata. The founders of needlework homes were Sudanese Muslim women who had attended Christian missionary schools, including institutions run by the British Church Missionary Society, or CMS. Sudanese girls would come to their teachers' homes 6 days a week, where they would learn how to cook, clean, and sew. And as far as I can tell, there's not a lot of information about the schools that I've been able to find. These schools were like home economics programs, but without the academic, book-centered emphasis. Meanwhile, the field of home economics continued to develop in Egypt. In 1939, 12 years after attending an international conference on home economics in Rome, which shows that the movement was expanding to Italy too, an Egyptian Ministry of Education employee named Fatima Fahmy published a 3-volume Arabic textbook called At-Ta'lim al-Manzili, Domestic Education. 2 years later, in 1941, Two Egyptian women who had studied domestic science in England, a well-known cookbook author named Nazira Nicola and her colleague Bahia Othman, published an Arabic cookbook and textbook called al-tahi, Principles of Cooking. The Egyptian Minister of Education wrote the preface, in which he affirmed that women had major contributions to make to the intellectual awakening, or nahda, of Egypt. In 1948, Nazira Nicola and Bahia Othman published another volume, also for the Egyptian Ministry of Education, called Idarat al-Manzil al-Nazari wal-Amali, Home Management Theory and Practice. Their books, which went through multiple editions until the 1960s, offered a model for the Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking. Okay, so now why did Madina Babikr al-Ghali and Nafisa Khalil Jabbara write their book instead of simply using the Nicola and Othman Arabic volume from Egypt? The answer seems to be that they were writing a Sudanese national book for a government-sponsored curriculum that aimed to instill ideas about national independence and modernity in the post-colonial context. And yet, the book that they produced lacks much explicitly Sudanese content. And I'll here digress briefly from the subject of women's labor to survey features of the book that illuminate aspects of Sudanese history and culture in this period. These features suggest, I think, how we can apply this research to another theme of our conference, creative methodologies, by extracting information on a wide range of subjects from this volume. So again, by the time al-Ghali and Jabbara published their book in 1973, as they put it, for the female student and the mistress of the house equally, they were following and contributing to an international movement that had both academic and professional dimensions. They described their book in the introduction as a study of the scientific and practical knowledge about the principles of nutrition. They offered advice on preparing meals for nuclear families, and we can see that these were nuclear and not extended families because of the portion sizes in the recipes. They surveyed the equipment necessary for a modern kitchen, discussed hygiene, and included a chapter which I love called Dirasat al-Ghasl, Studies on Washing, about laundry and the care of different fabrics. You can see silk, wool, etc. And then there's another chapter, this chapter heading I love this chapter. This is on household cleaning preparations, like how to make your own cleaning solutions for things. They advised moderation and prudence, not luxury or decadence, connected diet to health conditions such as malnutrition and obesity, and prescribed exercise as a route to good health. The modern woman they featured was domestic and scientific. They emphasized science in the first pages by discussing vitamins and minerals like calcium and iron and explaining how they fortified the human body. They included charts listing the nutritional content of various foods in grams and percentages, for example, the amount of vitamin C in pineapples and watermelons, showing the importance of both literacy and numeracy, that is, the ability to interpret data in both words and numbers. And I couldn't bring the cookbook, so I've brought a partial printout so you can see all of the charts and the high level of literacy and the ability to read the numbers and the figures required. This is a very sophisticated, high expectations of the academic skill needed to process this information. And it's not a great scan, but I should also mention the quality of the printing of the original book is not that great either in terms of the printing quality. They included a section called Foods Prevalent in the Sudan, which discusses grains like wheat, sorghum, and rice, and then foods like peanuts, whose name in Arabic has a national ring or nationalist ring to it already, Ful Sudani. That's the Arabic word for peanuts. It literally means Sudanese beans in a way. And this section then surveys different kinds of fruits and vegetables and dairy products and the like. In fact, the foods included in the section on foods prevalent in the Sudan seem very generic. The vegetables listed, radishes, tomatoes, onions, peppers, and so on, could be from anywhere. They could be from Paris or Philadelphia, as much as Cairo or Khartoum. The book does not include, for example, molokhia, a vegetable common to the Nile Valley and prized as an ingredient in soups and stews. Even the English name for it, apparently jute mallow, wouldn't register in most English speakers' minds. It's not a vegetable known to most Europeans, Americans, and Asians. Nor does the book include okra, bamia. Perhaps the authors were modeling their book on an Egyptian Arabic source like the Nazira Nicola and Bahia Uthman volume, and that text may in turn have been modeling itself on American or British examples. And this is something that I intend to follow up by looking at the Egyptian versions. The Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking includes hundreds of recipes, but few of them seem distinctly Sudanese either. Exceptions are recipes that could also be Egyptian, such as fool, fava bean puree of various kinds, or I noticed one recipe that intrigued me, possibly reflecting Turkish influence, perhaps mediated through Egypt, such as a recipe for stewed vegetables called turli, which seems to be a Macedonian or Albanian word for the dish that Turks call turlu. And this is from the Wikipedia, the picture on the right here, it's from the Wikipedia article for the Macedonian and Albanian food. And so it's not from a Sudanese source, but I found the recipe and I compared it. And I wonder if the authors, again, got this recipe from an Egyptian textbook, or if the recipe offers evidence for 19th century Turco-Egyptian or Ottoman influence on the Sudan from the period between 1821 and before the Mahdist Revolution. There are sections for foods suitable in the cookbook for breakfast and lunch, winter and summer meals, fish, and so on. There are separate chapters for buffet parties, that's one of my favorite chapters, and tea parties, which advise readers to be certain of having enough chairs, setting the tables properly, and making sure to prepare food to satisfy guests. There are also chapters for things like chicken, hot and cold sweets, frozen desserts, and preserved foods such as fruits, jams, and jellies. The chapter on macaroni and rice strikes me as particularly important from the viewpoint of culinary history because white wheat flour, which is the main ingredient, of course, in macaroni, and rice would have been relative newcomers to popular Sudanese diets, probably a post-World War II development for most people. I should have probably called this side like refined and not refined, like raffiné, because refined in English can refer also to the highly processed wheat, which is what goes into macaroni. But yeah, I think there are class dimensions here. I do not see any recipes in the cookbook for sorghum, a grain that remained essential to Sudanese diets into the 20th century, as Stephen Searles has noted in his book about famine, food insecurity, and the British manipulation of food policy in the late 19th and early 20th century Red Sea region. So it's very interesting choices. The Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking targets Muslim readers explicitly, which is also striking from the point of view of post-colonial nationalism. It begins with the Bismillah, the Muslim invocation of God's name in Arabic. It contains a lengthy chapter on Ramadan, with advice on how to manage fasting and how much and when to eat and sleep. The recipes in this Ramadan chapter include restorative and rehydrating foods such as cucumber salad and tomato soup. The chapter also gives sample fast-breaking menus. So to the extent that this Arabic book is Sudanese in its content, and to the extent that it refers to religious culture, it advances a vision that is exclusively Islamic. The Guide to Modern Cooking assumes that readers are female. There are a lot of things it assumes. It assumes that readers are female, Muslim, educated, intelligent, married or planning to be married, responsible for care of a family, and enjoying access to a modern home with abundant food. The book appealed to members of Sudan's aspirational Muslim middle classes, presenting a lifestyle that combined work and leisure and comfort and respectability with austere elegance. The book prompts several questions. How many of its female readers would have had the resources to reach its standards? How many, for example, would have had the kind of stove that appears in the illustration on the book's cover? And how many had the freezer to make one of the ice cream recipes from the chapter on frozen foods? How many urban Sudanese young women, or their mothers if they were not yet married and living in homes of their own, had access to the kitchen's utensils and appliances that would have enabled them to do the kind of work and to make the kind of food that the textbook was imagining? Depending on their social circumstances, how many would have expected to do such manual domestic labor themselves, washing their family's cotton clothing, for example, as opposed to relying on servants to do the work for them? In short, how many of the students who studied home economics lived lives like the ones that this book was projecting? Answering questions like these would require much deeper research, perhaps again by conducting oral histories or surveys and examining magazines and newspaper advertisements to assess the cost and availability of consumer products. To study changing patterns of food consumption, thinking again about the chapter on macaroni and rice dishes, we could look for agricultural data and information on food imports. Also bear in mind that when this book appeared in 1973, Sudanese labor migration to oil-rich countries, especially Libya, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states, was just beginning. It was starting to build momentum. So the remittance economy was taking off, enabling migrants to secure luxury consumer goods such as clothes washing machines. Yet even if Sudanese material and culinary culture was rapidly changing in 1973 when this book appeared, making it possible in theory for more Sudanese women to make ice cream at home, not all secondary school graduates would have gone on to to be able to access the resources and lifestyles that this book was modeling. A fascinating book about the history of women's household labor in the British Isles, written in 1982 by a scholar named Caroline Davidson and covering the period from 1650 to 1950, offers comparative lessons for us. Davidson argued that the single most transformative modern innovation affecting British women's housework was not electricity, as important as that was. It was rather the advent of piped water, which saved women from the arduous labor of fetching and carrying water from rivers or wells, and which made it possible to clean things and to wash clothes more often. Piped water also allowed for toilets, which transformed domestic sanitation. Davidson studied British women, but I wonder about comparable trends for Sudanese women. When did most Sudanese women in urban or rural areas gain access to piped water? Davidson also studied how long it took for most British households to get new technologies and conveniences as they became available, with longer delays, not surprisingly, in rural areas. By 1951, she wrote, only 52% of households in England and Wales had the following three things: a kitchen sink, an indoor toilet, and a fixed bathtub, while 45% still lacked a bathtub, 21% a water closet or toilet, and 12% a kitchen sink. If we could find comparable data for urban and rural parts of the Sudan in the early 1970s, we could better understand how aspirational the Guide to Modern Cooking was and how it reflected or did not reflect conditions in Sudanese homes. So to conclude, the Guide to Modern Cooking sent mixed messages about women, their bodies, and behaviors. In one section, which recommends exercise, the book includes an illustration that makes the Sudanese woman look like a Barbie doll, super skinny with long legs and prominent breasts. Like the Barbie movie, which appeared in 2023, this textbook and cookbook raises questions about women's liberation and repression, when or if it happens, and how it looks. Was the Guide to Modern Cooking a feminist book, or its opposite? Did it empower young women and boost their self-esteem by treating them as future domestic professionals? Or did it stifle women's ambitions and perpetuate their economic dependence on men by keeping them busy at home baking cake? Historians who have studied home economics in the United States note that many women who completed middle school, secondary school, or even university programs in this field then used their training to secure paid jobs and pursue careers, especially as teachers in home economics programs or as nutritionists, product developers, or marketing experts in food companies. Others advanced into fields like chemistry, public health, and medicine. I suspect that we could find a similar trend in the Sudan, of home economics offering a stepping stone to professional advancement for some women. And yet, many scholars have also noted that home economics programs in the United States may have had the effect or the ulterior motive of binding women more firmly to households, keeping their labor invisible or unrecognized, and promoting a cult of domesticity. Leaders in this field arguably reinforced gender segregation by treating home economics as a female subject, a premise that lent itself to the reciprocal idea that other subjects belonged to men. This approach eventually compromised the credibility of the field of home economics and prompted a feminist backlash. As a result, by the time the Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking appeared in 1973, decades after similar Arabic textbooks had appeared in Egypt, the field was on its way out, as the expression goes. It was certainly starting to contract and disappear from schools and universities in the United States, the country where it began. Indeed, in 1972, just 1 year before this Sudanese textbook appeared, the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. passed an important piece of legislation called Title IX of Educational Amendments Acts of 1972. We still call it Title IX. This law, which is still in force, although often unevenly applied and contested, and I quote, prohibits discrimination based on sex in education programs and activities that receive federal, that is, public, financial assistance, end quote. Today, most Americans remember this law as the law that requires schools to give women as many opportunities, as many resources as men in sports. So that, for example, if a university sponsors a men's soccer, meaning football team, then it must give comparable resources to support a women's team too. As I learned, however, while doing the research for this paper, the same law that tried to end sex discrimination in public school programs at the primary or secondary school levels, and that had such an important impact on athletics, had really big consequences for home economics. Namely, this 1972 law required American schools to include boys in home economics classes, and reciprocally to give girls access to subjects that in many places had been offered only to boys before. And suddenly, when I learned this, I understood something about my own education, my own educational history, which I had only dimly sensed before, which is why my much older sisters studied home economics when they were in school in the late 1960s, whereas students in my cohort in the 1980s studied carpentry. My sisters learned to sew their own clothes in school, which I did not, which is why I asked Juliet the question about who was sewing. Whereas I learned how to make a bookshelf. I do not yet know what the implications of this U.S. law may have been for Sudanese history and home economics in Sudanese schools, but I have no doubt that the American developments would have been relevant. So why do I think that? I think that because the histories of home economics, women's professional education, and women's labor were unfolding on an international stage. And also because from the 1970s onward, educational and labor migrations from the Nile Valley to Europe and North America were accelerating, allowing for the more rapid and extensive exchange of ideas. The Sudan and Egypt, the United States and the United Kingdom, were following similar paths while sharing ideas and practices in ways that are relevant for our study of women and labor. So I will conclude there, but with two extra thoughts. One is, going back to the theme, what creative methods can we employ to expand histories of women in work? I've tried to use just one book today and drawing out what we can from a book. So I would say use everything, including ephemeral sources, along with visual and material evidence, and come at the subject from all angles. And actually, there was something that Daniela said on the first day. Your final slide, you said you had a slide called The Power of the Anecdotal, but then you said, it wasn't on your slide, and I think this is an even better phrase, the power of the incidental. What we can get and it goes back to what Noor said about life history narratives, and also to what Akosua said about the River of Life as an interview method, is that we might be asking people to tell stories and we might have a particular interest, but they happen to say something else, and then later we realize it's important. So we have to use all of that. I have one last thing to show you. I could not bring the Sudanese Guide to Modern Cooking, but part of my interest in this subject is from the fact that when I was a child, very small child, this book was on my family bookshelf at home. It belonged to my sisters. I don't know which sister, I have to find out. It was published in 1967. It's an American home economics cookbook, probably the last major cookbook. I found it on eBay, which goes back to my question about the research power of eBay. And I used eBay over the years, and I was fascinated as a child by these maps, which showed, like how you should have a scientific kitchen, which would also be labor efficient, by doing things like, reducing the time to walk from the refrigerator to the stove. And I love that one. And then there's and I'm going to pass this around, and you can see, because the Sudanese cookbook, it feels exactly like this. The chapters are the same. The material is the same. That's why I also think that there was a borrowing of these books. You see the layouts of the plates and how you should be organizing your buffet tables. And I remember even as a child thinking, wow, there are people who live like that, who can have like all of these plates and all of these different kinds of spoons and forks, and who know where to put them on the table. Because obviously there were, these very clear class registers that the book was projecting. And so for me as a child, this was fascinating and also very aspirational too. So I can kind of relate very much to this book that I read. And anyway, so thank you very much.